Hello, I'm Gavin Ashenden. This is Catholic Unscripted. We find ourselves at a moment of serious civilizational crisis, and it all has to do at the moment with the sacrifice of babies. In the United Kingdom, we're changing the law to decriminalize abortion for women until the point of birth itself. One of the questions we face is whether or not the terms in which we describe this particular culture. I've been talking to a member of the House of Lords who's organising the resistance to some of this legislation, though the Lords can't overturn the will of the Commons. And he's been describing it as a need for a coalition of people who are concerned with human rights. One of our points is that human rights, of course, is derivative entirely from Christianity and Catholicism. And I'm very proud to be part of a team in Catholic Unscripted, where we're trying to pursue a struggle against the prevailing culture, which is not just undermining human rights, but essentially ushering in a new paganism. One of the things I think we have to try and do is articulate the Christian position, which is that only Christianity offers the promise of protecting people by giving them the mark of God himself upon them, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and consequently touch us and you touch the Father. Every human being is given rights by virtue of their Creator. And how do we know who the Creator is? Through Jesus, of course. And how do we commit this struggle into action? By the Holy Spirit. So the Trinity are involved, but we need to explain that if you remove Christianity, you remove the protection of people. And the very first people who experience that are babies. And so what I want to do in this short reflection is to think of, first of all, the nature of that protection, and then what it is that paganism does, because very few people are historically educated enough or theologically educated enough to know what hangs in the balance. I want to go to Tom Holland to begin with. Tom Holland is moving towards Christianity. One of the things he's done in his book, which was intended to explain how all the benefits of our culture derive from Christ and Christianity, he talks about the way in which our civilization moved from paganism to Christianity when a woman called Macrina went out into the rubbish dumps of the city and collected from them dying children and took them home to raise them. Mother Teresa of Calcutta continued that extraordinary act of witness. But I'd like to read to you Tom Holland's description of how and when that happened. So he was talking to an interview with a feminist, and one of the things he said is, of course, the idea that life is precious, and particularly the lives of those who are vulnerable is precious, is something that's been crucial to the practice of Christianity since the very beginning. So one of the markers of a Christian city, archaeologically, as opposed to a pre-Christian city, is that the pre-Christian cities in their sewerage will have lots of bones of small babies in it, babies that were literally thrown out with the trash. And with the coming of Christianity, Holland claims, that ends. What Christianity did was to stop children being thrown out with the trash, or in today's language, incinerated, of course. Holland went on to say, this reflects a way in which, say, in the 4th century, in the wake of Constantine's conversion, you have people who will tour rubbish dumps outside cities looking for abandoned babies who would either be left to die or captured by slavers and raised as slaves or prostitutes or whatever. And that, of course, is an expression of commitment to preserving the lives of those who are absolutely the most vulnerable. And obviously the arguments, he says in this discussion with a feminist, the arguments against abortion are drawing on that tradition. So notions like human rights or the existence of something called the secular, which is absolutely bred of Christian history and Christian theology, have been rebranded as something that's common property to all cultures. Well, now the member of the House of Lords that I was talking to can make use of that as he draws all cultures together under the umbrella of human rights. But the difficulty is that human rights also depend upon Christianity. It is the glue that holds them together and the fountain that gave birth to them. There's a lovely paragraph about Gregory of Nyssa, who had a sister called Macrina. And this is the moment that notionally Tom Holland picks out to talk about the hinge between moving from paganism to Christianity. So writing about Gregory of Nyssa, he says, he noted that his brother Basil and Gregory were enormously important theologians, was his teacher. In his insistence on the equal worth of human beings, however, he was more influenced by his older sister, Macrina, who you don't really hear of much in theological studies. The oldest child in the family, it was Macrina who had convinced Gregory to abandon an aristocratic civil career and take up work in the church. She was well educated and highly intelligent also, but she took on an ascetic life, devoted herself to the caring of the sick and the poor with a passionate intensity that marked all the family's endeavours. In a world where infanticide was widely practiced, with infant girls being the most commonly abandoned to death, Macrina searched garbage dumps for babies left to die and brought them home to raise them. When she died, Tom Holland notes, it wasn't his brother, the celebrated bishop, whom Gregory thought to compare to Christ, but his sister, Macrina, the baby saver. I want to turn to some work by John Anderson, who's an American journalist. He's written a book called Paganism, Pagan America. One of the things John does is to try and demonstrate to us historically that paganism was a religion founded upon child sacrifice. Now, few people know much about this. They have some very hazy ideas. What John does is to bring us evidence from pagan Europe, pagan Africa, pagan South America. I'd just like to bring you, first of all, his notion on pagan Europe. People know about the Vikings, and they understand the Vikings worshipped Thor, and they were extraordinarily good at sailing and mayhem, rape and murder. But the notion that they sacrificed babies has been either lost or deliberately suppressed. So John wants to take us to a place called Trelleborg, where archaeology began in 1934. There was a fortress there, and it was excavated. And to their great shock, the archaeologists found at places of sacrifice, and particularly the bottom of wells, human skeletons of children. They didn't know what to make of this because the secular intellectual academic narrative were the pagans had a certain kind of glorious vivacity to them. They were sort of almost as if the noble savage. And the idea that pagans sacrificed children to their gods was one that was deeply inimical to the secular culture of the time. The problem was the evidence kept on stacking up. Not only in Trelleborg in 1934, but in 1977, Tissot in Denmark, another place, they found, with the ritual slaughter of goats, skeletons of children. And once again, the evidence was that the pagan Vikings had sacrificed children to their gods. The same thing is true of evidence in Africa, but Anderson takes us also to South America. He portrays the Aztecs, and once again, people know a little bit about the Aztecs, but they don't know about the centrality of the sacrifice of children. Let me read you a little bit from Anderson. It's very powerful. Nearly 5 centuries after the Swedish king Inge the Elder, a devout Christian, destroyed the pagan temple at Uppsala, a center of child sacrifice, Cortes arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to the scenes of pagan ritual butchery that far surpassed what even the most pious Viking pagans undertook. In the dismal annals of pagan butchery, the Aztecs are in a class with the Carthaginians. Do you know much about the Carthaginians and the sacrifice of their children to Baal? Well, probably not. It's not been taught by our history teachers. The Carthaginians enslaved their neighbors and regularly sacrificed their children to the god Baal. If you remember, the competitive god, the children of Israel were told they had to resist at all costs. When Cortes and his men first entered the sprawling imperial city, they were greeted by massive racks displaying thousands of human skulls from sacrificial victims at the Templo Mayo, a vast religious complex at the center of this Aztec metropolis, dominated by a pair of pyramids dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of water and rain, and Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun. And the pyramids were flanked by two rounded towers made entirely of human skulls and decomposing heads. Or so said Andres de Tapia, a soldier and chronicler who served under Cortes. For many decades, his account was dismissed by modern historians, goes on Anderson, as an exaggeration to justify the killing of Emperor Moctezuma II and the subjugation of the Aztec people. Admittedly, the Aztecs engaged in human sacrifice, but surely, said the secular historians, their pagan rituals was not as bad, morally, as the Spanish conquistadors, who were the real villains, and trying to detract from their own villainy, imposed it on the Aztecs. So went the dominant narrative in polite academic educational circles anyway. But in 2015 and 2018, archaeological excavations at Templo Mayo, which lies at the center of the present-day Mexico City, revealed just what Andres de Tapia had accurately described. Archaeologists first discovered a skull tower there in 2015, unearthing row upon row of human skulls mortared together in a circle, hundreds of them, all arranged to look inward towards the empty center of the tower. Then in 2018, researchers found a basketball court-sized skull rack, a wall of skulls 35 meters long, 5 meters high, with wooden poles passed through them, as if to put them on display. These were the racks Cortes and his men had seen on their first visit to the city in 1519. At that time, the bodies of the beheaded victims would have been consumed by Aztec nobles and high-ranking officials in acts of ritual cannibalism, a fact attested to not just by contemporaneous accounts, but also by the human bones found in Mexico City that archaeologists say bear obvious butcher marks, prepared by butchers for eating. As Cortes soon discovered, the extreme violence and depravity of the Aztec pagan civilization was based on a particular cosmology, which demanded ritual human sacrifice and cannibalism on a massive scale. Idols of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli were housed inside shrines atop each of the main pyramids in Templo Mayo, shrouded from public view. The worship rendered to these pagan deities, Anderson goes on, was straightforwardly evil, the stuff of nightmares. It's not too much to call it demonic, diabolical, wicked. Words fail utterly to capture what the Aztecs did. Before sacrifices were offered to Tlaloc, for example, the ground had to be wetted with human tears. To make these child victims cry, Aztec priests would pull off their fingernails before slaughtering them. These were not rare or one-off occurrences, but part of regular religious rituals. Until 2018, Templo Mayo had the distinction of being the site of the largest mass child sacrifice event, 42 children at once, in recorded history. But the discovery in April 2018 on Peru's northern coast of more than 140 children, accompanied by 200 young llamas, all of them apparently killed in a single mass ritual sacrifice somewhere in the half of the 15th century, currently holds the record. Anderson talks about the way in which Cortes was determined, by burning his boats, to offer Catholicism to the pagans, partly in an attempt to stop child sacrifice, and to replace child sacrifice with the sacrifice of the Mass. In a very strange way, we're back there again. I've told the story a number of times. I hope you'll forgive me for repeating it, about the point when I moved in my views on abortion. I was hosting a faith and ethics BBC radio program. Someone called in. I was agnostic. I checked the figures as she was talking and discovered that 6 million unwanted preborn babies had been disposed of in the UK by our legislation. 6 million is a particularly significant number in European history of the 20th century. And I said something like, but that's a Holocaust. If they're human beings, that's a Holocaust of human beings. I was threatened with sack the next day by my BBC editor. Be that as it may, I then began to think, what if human life begins at conception? What if the Catholics are right? What if the preborn are human beings with all the rights of human beings? What if the killing of the preborn is murder? Where is the evidence that life starts at a different point? Even in the last 40 hours, I've had discussions within my extended family where I've been told by well-educated relatives that fetuses don't experience pain. And I said, but out there on YouTube, you can see a fetus in the womb hiding from the instruments of abortion, curving up into the wall of the mother's womb protectively. In fact, it was these videos that were responsible for the managers of one of America's leading abortion clinics to change his mind and to become an anti-abortion campaigner when he actually saw what happens in the womb. And the pictures of what we do, the way in which they are dismembered in the womb are banned by the public media because they know only too well they will cause horror and revulsion to those who see them. And now we've passed legislation which envisages medical abortion of children up to the moment of birth. We can take a philosophical critique of this, a political one, but essentially, as Catholics, one of the things I think we need to do is to recognize that the deaths of children in our culture on this scale are not just a matter of medical outrage or philosophical confusion, but they are, in fact, the sacrifice of children. If they're a sacrifice of children, to what? Well, initially, I suppose we can say to a lifestyle. The other night, Catherine was talking with her stepdaughter, Emily, a Catholic woman of 30, who relayed the conversation amongst her peers that they didn't want to get married, they didn't want to get pregnant. If they got pregnant, they would be willing to have an abortion, because if they didn't have an abortion, they would no longer be able to go skiing. They'd no longer be able to take holidays. They wouldn't be able to pursue the lifestyle of a single, well-educated, professional woman with all the benefits of feminism. One of the extraordinary things about feminism, of course, is the psychological dissonance of the arguments. At one level, feminists say, this is my body, my choice, mimicking in a rather awful, parodic way the words of Jesus at the Eucharist. And they demand the rights of a woman to have control over her body and expel, as a parasite, a fetus within it. But if one was to say that half of the 10 million preborn children that have been ritually murdered by our abortion industry were girls, were women, what would the feminists say then? Do they have no duty to protect preborn women? They do, of course. And so why this dissonance? Why this impossibility of recognizing there is a profound conflict in their own value system between what they're advocating, what they're doing, and what they actually believe? At this point, we have to use the words of spirituality, of metaphysics. If you can't explain something rationally, then that's the point at which we're allowed, I think, to turn to the language of religion. It really looks as though lifestyle issues are the new gods. You can describe a god, as Jordan Peterson often does, as your prime value, the thing right at the top of the hierarchy of things that matter to you. These are the gods. Everyone has gods. One of the things that secularists miss out is that the notion that there is just one God whom they reject is primitive and really rather stupid. Everyone has prime values to which they dedicate themselves and for which they make sacrifices. For some people, it might be education. For other people, it might be politics. For the feminists, it's little babies. Little babies get sacrificed to feminist autonomy. That's the God. What if John Anderson is right, and behind the universe there are indeed a number of different gods? Christians have always called them demons, the demonic realm. Demons always demand sacrifice from their adherents. What if the cosmology we inhabit, in fact, contains both good and bad angels, obedient angels and fallen angels? And it is the work of fallen angels to seduce us away from the real God and from Christ, who demonstrates who God is, in order to worship other values, other gods, other demons. This would explain some of the cognitive dissonance. This would explain why, as a society, we're willing to close our eyes to the pictures of human beings with fingers and toes, fingernails sucking their thumbs, moving like swimmers in the wombs of their mothers, and to dismiss them as clumps of cells, and to allow them to be dismembered in the name of different gods. The danger is that we are returning to a form of paganism, and if we don't explain the Catholic worldview and the issues to the people we live amongst, the pagan view will prevail, and the cost of that will be enormous.